I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Dan Goldwasser. He's an assistant professor in Purdue's Department of Computer Science. His research interests include natural language processing and applications of machine learning for textual data. His work focuses on real-world applications, such as machine comprehension and political discourse analysis, which require machine learning algorithms capable of connecting raw textual data, world knowledge, and dynamic real-world behaviors. Today, he will present a talk titled Toward Artificially Intelligent Information Safeguards, Algorithms for Distinguishing Between Opinions, Facts, and Alternative Facts. Dan Goldwasser.
Thanks so much. This is much louder than I thought. Hi, and thanks for coming to my talk. And also thanks for the nice introduction. Today I'll talk about my area of research, natural language processing. I'll also talk about the type of challenges this field now has to adapt to with the so-called emergence of, or the emergence of the so-called fake news, and what we can do about it. I'll also try to connect it to the general theme of this conference, which is dawn or doom. That is, what are the technological challenges and whether technology actually got us to where we are. So is there really a technological dawn or doom situation here? Just as a quick disclaimer before I start, I'm going to present some political sensitive context. It's intended in good humor. Please take it in the good humor in which it was intended. Not an easy task these days. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay with this? All right. Cool. All right. So natural language processing is kind of a fancy name to say basically the area of computer science which allows computers to deal with human languages. So natural here is distinguished from machine. So examples of natural language are English, Spanish, Chinese, the list goes on. Most of you have actually interacted with natural language processing systems, though you might have not known it at the time. So for those of you who've used Siri or Google Now or Alexa, that's a natural language processing system. For those of you who typed questions into Google and got an answer, that's a form of natural language processing. For those of you who used automatic translation, that's natural language processing, and so on. So the applications are everywhere, and it's not surprising, right? Because natural language is everywhere. And it's a very nice interface for us to connect with information that's available to us on the web. And really, this connection between the rise of the web and the popularity of NLP is strongly recognized. It was somewhat of a much smaller research area until the late 90s or mid-90s, where suddenly we had unprecedented amounts of text coming from the internet that were continuously updated and required automatic processing. So if we have to find a nice way to generalize what NLP is all about, a simple way to do it is to say we want to move from unstructured data to structured information. Right? So structured information is things we can use to our benefit. For example, we can post them on our calendar. We can populate a database with facts about the world by reading text, and so on. And really, with the rise of the internet, or until a couple of years ago, the two most popular applications that just about any organization had were information extraction and sentiment analysis. Information extraction means you have some facts about the world expressed in the text. You want to mine them and put them in a database somehow. And sentiment analysis is you assume that people have opinions, they feel differently about different things, and you want to gauge public opinion. And for all of you who are using Amazon, Yelp, or just leave comments for products or videos, those comments are analyzed using tools such as Sentiment Analyzer for people to let organizations know if you like their videos, if you like their products, what aspects of their product they need to improve, and so on. And both of these have been hugely successful and very, very popular. But this sort of simplified view of the world is really changing, and changing fast these days. And it has to do with the rise of social media. And really, like, a massive amount of text is being generated every day on social media. This is highly valuable information. It's a dynamic news source, which allows us to learn about events as they develop, for example, by following what happens on Twitter. It allows us to gauge public sentiment about different events and political figures and our favorite sports teams. It can also shed light on public discourse, which is something that can inform our decision-making and our policies. And the type of content that we see on social media is this strange mixture of opinions, facts, and what has become known as alternative facts. So our sort of nice distinction of, well, we have opinions that we find in one place and facts that we find in another, no longer really holds in these new settings, right? And in addition to the general confusion, there are also intentional efforts to manipulate the conversation on social media, and as a result, we need to account for that and for the biases that are introduced by interested parties. For NLP to keep growing and to be used in those challenging settings or bring value in these challenging settings, it now needs to adapt. For example, if we think about an automatic decision-making system that reads text and based on that decides what to invest on or decides what is the right policy that people are interested in, which is something which if we had perfect natural language processing systems, we can do with the information that exists on Twitter and social media. And we are definitely interested to do it. It's not easy, though. In this talk, I'll share my highly biased thoughts about how I view the problem, what led to this problem, and what we can do about it. As a spoiler alert, and hopefully some of you will remain here, I don't have any answers. It's really just my own biased thoughts, and if nothing else, I think that these questions should be raised. Okay. So really, we can summarize the problem as fake news, right? This is a term that's been used all over the place since the 2016 presidential elections. And these are two examples of fake news that appeared on the left and on the right about the content which is incorrect, and yet it had an unbelievable reach in terms of how far it got and how many people shared and posted it on their social media feeds. And instead of fake news, like as the joke goes that you're not a waiter, you are a food delivery stylist. So instead of calling it fake news, we might prefer the term information stylist. Because really, the way that this information, or sort of this fake information is generated, is not done in a random way, but rather it's styled to help support our conception, or the beliefs that we are predisposed to have. For example, if we look at the one about Donald Trump, this is something that most people who oppose Donald Trump would be likely to believe, right? So this is, if I were to run, I would run as a Republican. They are the dumbest group of voters in the country. And this is attributed to Trump in the 90s, right? So I think most people who oppose Trump would be willing to accept Mr. Trump as a somewhat cynical politician, right? If you were to invent a different lie about him, it might have not been accepted quite so widely. Similarly, the stories that were spread around the other candidate, Hillary Clinton, were also framed around the misconceptions that people had about her. Right? So really, this is not done in a random way. There is an invisible hand that generates this content, that thinks about what would be the best way to reach out, and this has been enormously successful, right? All of these fake news stories got sort of millions of shares. And I put here, and it's too small to see, but I put here a URL with a long list of all the fake news stories that had this sort of very wide reach. So really the first question or the question that I would like to pose is, and along the lines of the dawn or doom general theme, is, well, if this is a problem that technology created, can technology fix it? And you can see that I sort of qualify this statement by saying if technology, and if technology actually created this problem, which one? Right? Because we kind of like this, the whole idea or the whole premise behind Dawn or Doom is that there are these transformative changes going on in the world of technology, and as a result, they present both potential risks and opportunities. And the first thing that I would like to suggest that it's not all that new, but the fact that we have these technological advances makes the problem, or sort of exacerbates the problem. So if you had to guess, what would be the first thing you would blame, what technological advancement would you blame here? And really the answer to this is the internet, right? Because you can blame just about anything on the internet. And this is kind of a fun meme that was going around at the time. The problem with internet quotes is that you can't always depend on their accuracy. And this is attributed to Abraham Lincoln. Clearly, he did not say that. The glasses and the beard are, of course, ironic. So this is... So while the spread of fake news is sort of was popularized by the internet, this is not a new problem. And sort of keeping up with Abraham Lincoln here, at the 1864 edition of fake news. At that time, Lincoln was running for re-election against his Democratic opponent. To help stop Lincoln's re-election, a Democratic congressman from Ohio, Samuel Coleman, started spreading a rumor blaming Lincoln for some devious plan, which I won't go into the details. This rumor was spread using an anonymous pamphlet. And this congressman referred to this anonymous pamphlet in his speech as fact. He also coordinated that spreading his own speech by a newspaper that were sympathetic to his cause. The spread of this newspaper was far-reaching at the time because of the recent inventions of cheaper print and the telegraph. Does that sound familiar? So we have a presidential election that's, very high stakes presidential elections. One side starts spreading an anonymous rumor. They start citing this rumor as fact, and then they make sure that friendly media outlets spread this rumor further. That sounds like something that happens today, right? This sounds very, very familiar, right? Before you feel, too sorry for Abraham Lincoln, he also dabbled in sort of media manipulation, and in the previous election cycle, he secretly sponsored a newspaper in Illinois to help spread his message. So I guess the take-home message first is Illinois politics were always kind of dirty, but using technology to spread your message by all means necessary is not a new thing. And really, we see this over and over again. As technology develops, the message resonates stronger. So this is sort of a, fast forward to the mid-30s, I guess, on the left and on the right, the 40s, where both Nazi Germany and the US built on a very rich and strong skill in the cinema. Both had a long tradition, either in Hollywood or in the German cinema. And they used that to spread their message. Just to make it clear, I'm not claiming any equivalence between the two, just the fact that both use this media very effectively. Leni Riefenstahl was a German filmmaker who helped glorify the Nazi goal. The movie that I chose to put here, Olympia, is about the 1936 Berlin Olympics. But she also made The Triumph of the Will that has more disturbing images. Frank Capra, from a well-known Hollywood director in the 40s, directed a series of movies, Why We Fight, that justified the reason why the US entered the war. the in the aftermath of this war, George Orwell wrote a super influential book called 1984, which also made a reappearance in the last year and made its way back to the bestseller list. And one of the quotes from this book that really resonated with me is as follows: "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." So by shaping how we perceive past events, we can shape what actions we will make, and we can shape how the perception of past events by controlling the present. If this sounds somewhat relevant to the discussion around removing the Confederate flags, it's not by mistake. Another reason why I chose to put this book is because it allows me to present you with a fun fact, and it will be a nice segue for today. This book, or this book and this sentence was presented the concept of the Ministry of Truth that, of course, was dealing with spreading lies. And it was modeled around the Ministry of Information, the UK Propaganda Office, which has been known for creating these signs and never distributing them. The one on the left is actually the original sign that was designed by the UK Information Office, and the other one is a meme modeled on top of it, or modeled on it circa 2010. Right, so no zombies. So this is also a form of fake news, though a funny one, and it also allows us to sort of fast forward to today. So over the last 20 years or so, journalism has changed dramatically, both in the way we consume information and the way this information is distributed. And up until, let's say 20 years ago, we had a very centralized view of information, right? So news organizations had to meet high ethical standards. They had to provide a balanced view. They had to fact-check story and verify their sources. Journalism was typically viewed as the watchdog for democracy and sort of pursuing the public interest. The way content was distributed was a physical paper, or trusted TV figures that gave you the news at exact times. And we used to think about this sort of mainstream media as sort of providing a balanced view between the left and the right, the conservative and the liberal, and we trusted them. Over the last 20 years, this changed dramatically. And there's this polarizing effect where figures from the left, and such as Jon Stewart was once voted the most trusted news personality for young people, and Fox News on the right, started taking a more prominent role. And really, this prominent role was conditioned on a social environment, right? So people represented here by this hipster giraffe sort of align themselves more with this comedic news. And people here by the conservative, represented here by the conservative, they would align themselves with conservative outlets. And unfortunately, this means that people who associate themselves with the centric view are usually in waiting rooms in airports. So it's an unfortunate effect. So what happened? How did this occur? So there's no one single answer. A couple of things that I would point to is that one thing, there were a couple of trends happening at the same time. The old information safeguards were starting to disappear. The fairness doctrine was eliminated in the late 80s, resulting in these sort of highly politicized news outlets. The way the content was distributed moved from a highly centralized to a highly decentralized distribution system. In this scenario, it's very hard to maintain and enforce those high ethical standards. But also the medium from which we consume the contents has changed, right? So we moved from a newspaper to a news website. And finally, in the last 15 years or so, we moved to social website in which we consume information. So there is no special role for a news organization when this information is distributed, but rather it's sort of a seamless part of our experience when we are on social media. We can see that also the way, well, this is a nice graph showing how the information flow was democratized and its negative effect. So the ones, the sort of the bluish circles represent trusted news organizations that do some form of fact-checking. The purple ones are propaganda websites, and the other ones, the sort of reddish ones, are clickbaits. And you can see, as represented by the edges, they're all sort of interconnected based on how people view them in the media. It's hard to distinguish one from the other. When it comes to consuming news on social media, the content of the news is contextualized by us. It's consumed inside the social network, which means that technology now has a much bigger role. First of all, this content is now personalized, and there are very strong recommendation algorithms that have been developed in the last 20 years to directly identify with high efficiency, with high accuracy, what are the type of things that we would like. And it's reactive to our social environment. So we can, based on the preferences of our friends, we would see content, and the type of friends that we will pick share similar views as us. And since we're viewing this information in a social environment, this information is now available to the people providing us with content. This resulted in the famous information echo chambers, in which our own biases just get reinforced over and over. From the content distribution side, we have a new business model. Instead of having newspaper, we have news aggregation sites, such as Google, Facebook, and so on. They are dominated by a small number of powerful players that have unprecedented amount of information about the user. So technology really comes into play in different ways. We have a distribution platform, a news website, or a social networking website. We can use the social information for targeting users. We can do content recommendation. And more importantly than that, we have measurable outcomes for engagement. So if this engine is making good decisions about the type of content that we would like, it's visible. We can train them. And in fact, these kind of websites optimize for engagement rather than diversity of opinion. Right? So remember the old days when, in order to get you to share things, Facebook just pushed a bunch of cute cats on your Facebook feed. So those are, in some sense, replaced by fake news stories to which you will respond. Right? So we're really optimizing. These websites are optimizing for engagement or for number of clicks, because this means higher profits. Another trend is not just the way information is distributed, also the way we consume information. This environment adapts to us, but we also adapt to this environment. So since we optimize the content that has potential for virality, for becoming viral. So a nice way to sort of deconstruct the reasoning here, I just have to share this Nature article, said no one ever. So if you have complex, long documents, nobody will ever see them. They are not viral. As a result, we are a lot more used to information nuggets that are very, very easy to read. In some sense, you can say that we replaced not reading the fine print into not reading anything other than the headline. This is how we usually consume information now, right? So on BuzzFeed, where I took this from, these images are actually moving because it's one of those GIF animations, which makes it a lot more annoying to watch. But really, you can see that there is a story being told here about Kim Kardashian shooting down some fake news story about Kylie Jenner. And you can see that really, in order to make us not to have a increased cognitive load for us, they give us a sentence, an image, a sentence, an image, and it goes on for a bunch. Really, and this means that the type of news that we're going to see is very, very highly simplified. And this actually makes the work of fake news a lot more convincing, because the type of mechanism that we used to have, like critical thinking and thinking thoughtfully about the type of information that we consume, are replaced by these sort of nice images and short sentences making it much easier for us to believe fake information because we don't really think about it. We just move on to the next one, press like, share, and move on. And really, this also works on the distributor side quite well, because if you're inventing the content rather than reporting it, you can really optimize for what people will like, right? You can generate fake news stories that would really hit the spot for the people who are interested in it, right? It's not just, I have a bunch of news stories, I'm going to pick the one that I think you would be most interested in. I'm going to invent a news story for you because I think you would react to that. So one of the famous cases that we've seen is people coming up with these fake news stories about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton saying things. But the future is even a little bit more scary. So this is, I'll let you listen to it.
Have you heard of this new technology? We're speaking about this new algorithm to copy voices. Yes, it is developed by a startup called Wirecard. This is huge. They can make us say anything, not really anything. The good news is they will offer the technology to anyone. This is huge. How does their technology work?
Hey guys, I think that they use deep learning and artificial neural networks.
Hillary is right. I can tell you that their team is great. I wish them good luck. I'm sure they will do a good job.
Okay, so this is clearly fake news. It's a startup company that uses deep learning to build a model of the speech of political figures. There's a ton of training information available because politicians tend to talk a lot. And as a result, we can build a model that would generate new speech that sounds like them, right? Here's another example that does the same thing for vision. I'm going to show the whole thing.
A target actor. We are able to manipulate YouTube videos in real time.
So you can see that this person is controlling what George Bush is, the facial movements of George Bush, right? We can make George Bush appear like he's saying whatever we want him to say. Again, if you look at it, it's not perfect. Anyway. So it's not perfect, both the speech and this. But then again, it's from last year. And 5 years from now, it's going to be better. But also, the bar is really low. Like, remember Pizzagate? Like, this is an insane story about Hillary Clinton running human trafficking network from a basement in a pizzeria in DC. And people bought it, and bought it so much that somebody actually showed up armed to the teeth. If you provide them with any shred of evidence that sounds or looks like something that they already believe in, how critical are they ever really going to be? That's a kind of a worrying thought. So that was the doom side of my talk. I guess my main point would be that technology shapes the information world in two ways. One way, which we already see happening, in the way we consume information and how this way creates information echo chambers. And in the other way, which is, I guess, I would call it future work, an undesired yet future work, we can generate content that's going to look more and more reliable, which is going to be harder and harder to distinguish from the real thing. OK. Now let's move to the done part of my talk. This part is going to be a little bit more technical. So if you feel the need to take a nap, like a post-lunch nap, then I won't be offended. OK. So we showed the doom part, which is like the challenges that help shape a very threatening and ominous view of the information world. Now the question is, can we use the same technology to build intelligent information safeguards that would help us navigate through it or help us achieve a better societal goal as citizens who can now make informed decisions? So the doom approach would be there's so much working against it, it's so hard, there's financial motivations not to do it. And the done approach would be, well, AI created the problem, so AI can fix it. The short answer to this question of whether this is possible or not is, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know if anybody knows. It's all opinions. And I want to share with you my opinion on this. I'm going to sort of lead you through a somewhat windy road in expressing this opinion by first showing what we usually think about as natural language processing and the type of things we can do today quite reliably. And then we'll try to think about how to go beyond this technology and scale up to the challenges that we just discussed. So maybe a good way to think about where we are in NLP and where we used to be, just to satisfy my historical curiosity. Who knows what this is? Okay, wow, not too many. Okay, so this is HAL, an evil computer built 16 years ago, according to 1960s sci-fi. This was the dawn or doom, or rather the doom of the 1960s by Isaac Asimov, a famous and somewhat pessimistic sci-fi writer. And he describes a world in which HAL, which is the spaceship's computer that controls everything, suddenly gains consciousness and starts pursuing its own goals rather than just taking instructions. I'm sure they're going to do a remake of this movie at some point. And this is really the most famous epic moment both in the book and the film that followed, which the last remaining astronaut on this spaceship that was not killed off by HAL yet realizes that HAL is behind those mysterious killings that's been going on. And he decides to go into the computer room and disconnect HAL, and by doing this, saving his own life. Unfortunately, the way to do that, to get into the computer room, is by asking HAL to open the doors. So Dave asks, open the pod bay doors, HAL, and HAL says, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm afraid I cannot do it. And this is sort of a chilling sort of scenario. So for cinematic value, this is really cool. If we think about AI today or natural language processing today, this is really, really unsatisfying, right? It's insanely optimistic. It's unrealistic. If you need to kind of break it down a little bit more, you can see that the ship's computer, HAL, understood the meaning of the word that Dave was saying. But beyond that, he was able to ground the meaning in a physical environment, not just open the door, but this is the specific door that you're going to open. But more than that, and this is perhaps the most mind-blowing thing of all, HAL was able to understand the situation and, as a result, the intent behind Dave's request. So HAL understood that Dave is asking to open the door so it can disconnect HAL, and this is something that HAL does not want to happen. And this is some impressive reasoning for a computer system. We're not there yet. This is the dawn or doom of a couple of years. Now let's consider a different scenario. Let's take your Siri or whatever assistant you have on your phone, and we're going to create a nicer version of it. And for those of you who are sort of CS freshmen, this could be your startup idea. Let's build a personal assistant that stops you from sending that angry email to your boss. It's 2 in the morning, you're working on a project that your boss assigned to you, you're super angry. You had one too many, you want to let your boss know exactly what you think of him, and your personal assistant, your phone tells you, I'm sorry, Dave, I'm not going to let you do it, you're going to get fired. Is this realistic?
Stop you from recognizing the words and the email you want to send it to certain words.
Right. So actually, this is pretty realistic, right? So it's pretty easy to say for your personal assistant to know who is your boss, or generally speaking, interpret your social relationships in terms of professional or just social friendships, and associate appropriate and inappropriate language with each one of those connections. Right? And it's actually a pretty easy problem. Again, for those of you who are looking for startup ideas, contact me after. On the other hand, so this is realistic, but how is it different than what we just said, right? So it needs to understand the word, it needs to understand the social context, but it also needs to understand the intent and the implication of doing an action. Right? So in some sense, the same type of problem is unrealistic in one scenario and realistic and quite easy in another. And really, this is the difference between sort of general AI and the type of things that we do in NLP. We try to find the middle ground between the lofty goals of general AI and things that can actually work. And in the continuum between those two, there are many useful things that we can do. So one example for useful thing that we can do is, well, personal assistants. They're quite nice. They're kind of fun to interact with. For those of you who are old enough to remember what was it like to deal with an automated response from, I don't know, AT&T 20 years ago, it was quite horrible. Today, they're actually kind of fun to interact, even though they're not perfect. Another thing that we can do really well is information extraction. We want to say something about, I'm almost out of time. We want to say something about what do we have in a document. We want to extract content. We can do it quite well. If you want to do sentiment analysis and say whether we like a product or not, and as a result generate some representation for the aspect that we like or we don't like, again, we can do it really well. And really, things become challenging because depending on what we're describing, we can use confusing vocabulary. So if we want to, for example, we want to describe a horror movie, something like, dude, I was watching this horror flick, selling points, nightmare scenes, torture scenes, terrible monster, it was so bad. So this is clearly a positive way to describe a horror movie. But if you're describing, for example, the popcorn that you bought using the same vocabulary, the outcome is, of course, a negative review. So don't buy the popcorn, it was terrible, the monster selling it must have wanted to torture me. So clearly, you can see that there's a lot of overlaps between the two, and despite that, one has complete opposite meaning from the other. So really, we can think about NLP as a way to resolve ambiguities. For the interest of time, I'll skip this example. So teachers strike idle kids could be read as teachers go on strike or teacher hit kids. So let's hope for the first one. A good way to deal with this ambiguity is is to use data, and machine learning has been insanely successful at doing it. So we think about language understanding as separating between good or bad and so on. In order to do that, we collect data, we annotate it, and we learn a classifier. This is not a magical solution, but it can work reasonably well. And if you think about it, we can think about characterizing each one of the documents that we have as the list of words that it has. So documents that we said are negative would be representing using their words, such as movie, terrible, and so on. And documents that are positive represent using positive words such as awesome, and so on. So in some sense, we can say awesome, mission accomplished. We know what we want to do. And we just have to say, let's take true statement and false statements in the same way we did for positive and negative reviews, and just learn a classifier by annotating data. Right? It's pretty easy. We have fact-checking organizations. They collect this kind of data. We can just throw it at the classifier. So here on the red side, we have things such as Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president, which is a false statement. And here are a couple of ones that I collected last night. So Roy Moore wins Senate GOP runoff in Alabama. And that is a reasonable way to do it. But is it? And this is really one of the key questions that we have to account for. Unlike sentiment analysis, where we can rely on words that indicate our sentiment, good, bad, and so on, in this case, we have to rely on a much deeper understanding of the world. So for example, we have to account for world knowledge, who is Pope Francis, who is Donald Trump, what are the values that they stand for, and then based on that make inferences, are the two values compatible and would justify one endorsing the other. Right? This is not simply represented as data. And since our news keep changing every day, this is not something that we can easily learn, right? Because we keep seeing new people, which require us to learn new things about the world, and so on. So I won't have time to go into all of the things that I want to do. That I wanted to talk about. We did about this problem, but I'll talk about at least one. So we tried treating it in the way that I just described. And in this case, when we did that, it wasn't so much about fake news. So we used satirical news. It was 2 years ago. In this case, we took one article from CNN, one article from The Onion. And our first attempt, we just threw data at a classifier. And what we saw that if you train and test it on information on articles extracted around the same time, it actually does quite well. But then we trained it on articles from 2009 and tested it on articles from 2016. And you can guess what happened. It crashed and burned. Instead of doing that, we decided to create an abstraction of the problem and think about it as a combination of inference, using world knowledge, and statistical methods. So in this case, we characterized the behaviors of different entities and their identities and the statements or the quotes that were expressed in the articles. This characterization, you can think about it as an abstraction, right? So we're going to map entities that have the same role into a single thing, all statements that are similar in some way into a single representation, and these representations are learned from data. Based on those characterization, we made inferences that would say how compatible they are with one another, and as a result, we were able to determine if this is fake content or not. The outcomes that we got is this was not perfect, but led to a significant improvement in our out-of-domain setting. So we still had, when we trained and tested on documents from different time periods, performance still dropped a little bit, but it was much more graceful than before. In order for these things to scale up, we have to go beyond that. We have to, so the Onion optimizes for laughs. Fake news are engineered to have an impact on society. We have to account for that. For those of you who are interested, I can talk to you after. Okay. So just to summarize, okay. So when we think about the road ahead in terms of adapting natural language processing systems to these kind of environments, we have to move away from fully supervised systems that just use data directly, throw data at a classifier, and hope for the best. We have to account for the type of common sense inferences and social information that stands behind these kind of phenomena. We have to think about language in its social context and read between the lines, identify inferences in cases people don't always say directly what they mean. Similar to the HAL example that I gave, we have to find the right balance between what is realistic and what is desired. So finding a fully automated fake news system might not be reasonable, but maybe we can think about a 90% solution where we can use artificial intelligence to scale up the capabilities of human information safeguards, namely editors and journalists. Or simply put, better together. And there's actually a couple of shared efforts across multiple research communities involving both AI, political science, and journalism for this goal. And that concludes my talk.
I guess we could take a couple extra minutes. We're a little over, but if anybody has a question or two.
So you were talking about characterizing different entities in the text instead of just throwing the training data. So is it similar to the named entity recognition, or is it creating an ontology of all the news?
So the idea is not to create an ontology, because ontologies have problems adapting as political figures change and events in the world change. Instead, we want to learn these from data. What we did from a technical perspective is create a latent representation of those entities And based on this latent representation, we were able to determine if two statements that use different words are similar or not, based on things such as the degree of formality of the text, the type of entities that were mentioned in it, and so on. So it's a data-driven process.
Right. So, but in that process, the knowledge representation is happening in the background. It has to be in some form, right? So, for example, a knowledge graph or some sort of thing. So, what is that? Is the real question.
So we don't maintain an explicit knowledge graph. Instead, we take the raw text and convert it into a narrative graph that tells us the connection between the entities, the statements that they make, and the activities they perform. We build inference chains on top of this representation.
Okay.
Right?
Thank you.
One more? No? Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Professor
Thanks so much.
Goldwasser.